dear listener. Welcome to Rise of the Rulelords Unchained. I'm your enigmatic and peculiar host, Pete, and I'll be your Rulelord for this evening. You've been sent this podcast because you've probably asked the question, what's the difference between Pathfinder 2nd Edition and Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition? And this podcast is designed to help you figure that out. Keep in mind, we're going to be trying to keep this episode system neutral, just going over the strengths, weaknesses, and differences between each system, allow you to be able to make your own choice into which game you want to play, or probably both. Joining me today is Navaar Jackson, host and creator of the Secret Nerd podcast, aspiring game designer and writer, and huge fan of Pathfinder 2nd Edition. How you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
So I gotta say, first off, you're doing a bad job with your podcast because you call it the Secret Nerd podcast, but I found it.
Yeah. It's just straight irony is what it is. But yeah, no, it really comes from just the things that we tend to not talk about as we kind of grew up in lives and stuff. And since my show is about talking to people about their individual experiences, it was something that I felt fitting because it was definitely something that happened to me when I was younger.
Yeah. So where can they find out more about your podcast and more about you?
Yeah. So you could find my podcast wherever you pod, on pretty much every app. And you can find me at Secret NRD Social on Twitter. That's where I'm the most active. I tend to interact more there, reach out to people, stuff like that. I also have an Instagram where you can just kind of find trailers and things like that for individual episode. And that is Secret Nerd Podcast on Instagram. And then, yeah, if you'd like to find all the other things I do, including a link to my itch.io where I have created one game and plan to create more, you can just go to secretnerdpodcast.com and find all the links you need there.
So what's been your experience with playing both Dungeons & Dragons or Pathfinder?
So when it comes to 5th Edition and Pathfinder 2e, I think I've played 2e maybe a few months longer than I played 5e. But it's like a year to a little over a year for both of them. And yeah, they're both very fun systems. I think they're both as easy to get into. Kind of just depends on which level you start at, which I think is the same for either one, right? Like if you're making a 10th level wizard in D&D, you're going to have a hard time if you never made a character before. And yeah, I think they're just both fun, but I do think that they have certain mechanics that help kind of separate themselves, and I'm excited to talk about those things.
Cool. So yeah, played both games, like both games. It sounds like maybe even dare to suggest that you can play both games if you want to.
Yeah, absolutely. I have recently. So yeah, I run a home game of Pathfinder 2e, and I've been a guest on a podcast. And awesome. Played a 8th level blade singing wizard.
All right. So the first big difference between D&D 5e and Pathfinder 2nd Edition is who they're made by. Tell us a bit about Wizards of the Coast.
So Wizards of the Coast is owned by Hasbro, and they've been the owners of the D&D license franchise or what have you for many, many years. Before that, it was TSR. But yeah, Wizards of the Coast is a very large corporation, and they are, I think they're both in the West Coast. But yeah, they're kind of where it originated for what we know today. And then, of course, Paizo and Wizards had their branch. Breaking there.
Paizo is the company that makes Pathfinder. They used to work for Wizards of the Coast as their dungeon magazine publisher. Then there was a split at some point. Then when Wizards of the Coast made the 4th edition of Dungeons & Dragons, Paizo started to use the open gaming license to publish Pathfinder. And over the years, that was very, very successful for them. They went about creating Starfinder and then came out with Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Now, I think it's fair to say that even though Paizo is Wizards of the Coast competitor, it's almost like comparing, I don't know, an indie game company with Nintendo. Wizards is huge. Hasbro itself is huge, owning the Star Wars, My Little Pony franchises, and Paizo just makes its little game.
It's quite different, yeah. And I mean, and you throw in Magic the Gathering into what they were doing as well with Wizards, and so I think having that heavy corporate backing and the name, right? The name is what brings pretty much everybody into what people who don't know about TTRPGs usually know, at least have heard of Dungeons and Dragons. And I think that's,
Yeah, it's definitely pretty much a name brand, the same as how like Band-Aid is adhesive medical strips, Kleenex is tissues.
Yeah, I once actually told a friend that. I said D&D is the Kleenex of TTRPGs, and he was like, "Well, what's Pathfinder then?" And I said, "Puffs Plus with lotion." So,
That's a apt description. So there's a lot of aspects about both games, but we're only going to be talking moving forward about the official stuff, the stuff that Wizards of the Coast produced, the stuff that Paizo produced, because that's the most equal footing that we can probably get between both of these companies and their product. There are a number of third-party publishers for both editions, and we'll talk about that at the very, very end. But for right now, everything that we're talking about until we say otherwise is either an official Paizo product or an official Wizards of the Coast product. So we're going to start with the very first decision that a player is probably going to make with their character creation, which is D&D's races versus Pathfinder's ancestries. So what can you tell us about the races of Dungeons and Dragons?
Yeah, so D&D still uses the term races in their game, and essentially these started out obviously with like pretty much what you would find in Lord of the Rings and early fantasy stuff. This kind of set the staple for fantasy TTRPGs. And so yeah, you have your like generally like your humans, elves, gnomes, halflings, orcs, and half-orcs. And then over the years, and especially now in 5th edition, this has increased to a variation as well, where you can start to see some of the more unique, I should say, or at least varied races as well.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the things that you're not going to just see sometimes in your player's handbook, where it's kind of that's like the core game.
Right.
As you get new books, then you can see some of this other stuff as well.
Yeah. So tell us a bit about some of the mechanical aspects of D&D that's the same when they're creating it. A couple of differences that I seem to think were of note when doing a character or when looking at D&D and Pathfinder character creation is that they both have ability score, they both have sizes, speeds, languages, some special abilities, and even sub-races, which Pathfinder seems to call heritages. So then what makes the racial component in Dungeons and Dragons unique?
I think one thing is that for the most part, there aren't flaws. There I think are a couple races now that have flaws, but for the most part, they just kind of have like, you get one ability is like a +2 and then one is a +1
mm-hmm.
for your race. And then, but theirs are still specific to kind of the general, like the general representation of that race.
Mm-hmm.
So like elves are charismatic and dexterous, and orcs are strong and have high constitution, things like that. So yeah, when it comes to your race, those are some of the things, depending on where their quote unquote culture is like based, then sometimes you'll get other things like the dark vision, the ability to do a single spell once a day. That doesn't always start at first level. Sometimes you get those at higher levels too, but it's usually not very overpowered at any point. And it usually happens a couple times.
Yeah. When I'm creating a Pathfinder character and I choose one of their ancestries, a couple of the things that I noted when creating them that didn't seem to be present on the D&D side was that Pathfinder ancestries give you starting hit points. They also have a series of unique traits being things that apply everywhere exactly the same wherever they're present. So like gnomes have the gnome trait and the small trait, or most creatures are medium. So that goes to size. But they also come with a unique ancestry feat. Pathfinder, as we'll go on, is very much built on a feat system. So being able to choose a feat in Pathfinder is one of the first big choices that a player is going to make when creating their character. Does D&D have any kind of similar mechanism?
No. So D&D is very specifically like you get these items, and that's kind of the standard. Depending on if you select a sub-race, that's the only time things kind of change. But outside of that, it's typically these are for your race and sub-race. This is the quote unquote feats that you get for your race. And that you brought up the HP, another one that says, well, there isn't an HP add-on or bonus or anything at that point. It's all just based on your class is kind of where that starts.
Oh, okay. So like you mentioned before, there are a lot of shared ancestries. I'm going to keep using ancestries.
Yeah, no, that's good. I like it.
Between both D&D and Pathfinder. Like obviously there's a couple of the big ones from Tolkien, but there also seem to be ones that both of them had at least close approximations of. D&D has the Kenku, Pathfinder is the Tengu, which is like a crow people. D&D has a Triton, Pathfinder
very different,
has Arcadi. Very different. How are they different?
The Kenku and the Tengu are very different. Yeah. But yes, they are both like raven folk essentially.
Right.
Yeah.
Then there's the fairy for D&D and the sprite for Pathfinder, the tabaxi for D&D, the catfolk for Pathfinder, the warforged, and then the automaton for Pathfinder, which are both kind of robotic people. Then D&D has a few that are races, whereas Pathfinder is treating them as heritages. The Genasi, Changeling, and Shifter for D&D seem to translate to the Suli, Changeling, and Beastkin for Pathfinder. Does that seem like a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. And even it's funny, like even the way you look at some of those things as they break down between the two, whereas like the Genasi is like a whole, they're kind of recognized as like you have this, essential genie ancestry in you, right? And a lot of the heritage on the Pathfinder side are kind of like you're mixed in with something, right? So it's like either a half human or a half elf, whatever. And then the other half of you, if you will, is this other thing. It kind of helps you take on those traits.
So D&D seems to have a couple of animal people that Pathfinder also has. With D&D, the Aarakocra, the Onin, those are lion people. Harengon is rabbit people. Owling is owl people. Turtle or tortoise people. Loxodon are elephant people. Lycanthra are froggish people. And Grung are salamanderish people. And on Pathfinder, we have the Null, which are like hyenas. Gripply, which are frogs. Kitsune, which are Japanese fox. Could classify it as something different. Rakfolk, and Shuni, which are pug people. I don't think we need to go too much into animals, but what are some of the unique D&D specific ancestries or races that they can choose from?
Yeah, so I remember when 4th edition came out, the big thing, like the big selling point that I'd heard for 4th edition, because I didn't play a lot of it, was Dragonborn. You could finally be a dragon. And Dragonborn has been moved into 5th edition as well, which essentially you're a humanoid dragon. You also have the Gith, which are, I think they're classified as two separate like sub races. I can't remember, the Githyanki and the Gith, I can't remember the other name, but essentially they're both like a good and evil race of creatures that live on the astral plane and they fight illithids. And then so then there's also Dragonborn. Dragonborn are separate from like kobolds and lizard folk. They're their own thing. The bugbears, which are like large furry hobgoblins, essentially, they kind of classify into the same. They're furbolgs, which are like giant, what are they? They're just like giant furry
nature people, like
Celtic druid kind of is what I get off of their artwork. Kalashar they're a race of like dreamers. The Vidalcan are part of the Magic the Gathering stuff, because they actually took things from Magic the Gathering and made it into a whole campaign setting. So there's a lot of stuff like that as well. And then like Yuan-Ti, which are a snake folk. And so Yuan-Ti is one of the ones as well that they still are codifying some races as evil races. I'm pretty sure Yuan-Ti is one of those as well. Yeah. And then they did another supplement, which was like kind of based on Greek mythology. So you have like minotaurs, satyrs, centaurs as well. And then, they have a Goliath, which is, I think for folks familiar with Pathfinder, would be the same as a half giant. And they're like a migrating 8 foot tall, just big, hairless giant people.
I don't think we don't have half giants in Pathfinder.
I don't think there's any in 2E, but I think there was in 1st edition.
Oh, okay.
The reason I say that because I'm pretty sure Glass Cannon Podcast encountered a half giant at some point. And then also Critical Role started as a Pathfinder game. And I think that Travis's character was a half giant before he became a Goliath.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So Pathfinder also has a couple of unique ancestries. There's the Fetchling, which seem like maybe they kind of serve the same role as the Gith, where they live on the shadow plane, and then a couple of them have come over to the material plane. They've grown like stark white, black eyes. They really value color as a society. There's a fan favorite called the Leshy, which are little plant people, all kinds, cactus, flower. There's a entire book being made about Leshy ancestries. There's the Kanrasu, which came from the Mwangi Expanse book. And gosh, I don't even know how to really describe them. They're like sentient
like
trees.
I don't even think it's like a sentient abstract statue that's powered by an Ioun stone. It's kind of
I loved seeing them. I so want to play one at some point and just like figure out what they are, because they look super cool. The Anati are ones that they're basically spider people, but why I still included them as like a unique ancestry for Pathfinder is that they also turn into people. So you can do both. You can look like a person and then look like a spider person, and they're actually really, really cute. Also from the Mwangi Expanse.
Yeah, as long as you don't have arachnophobia, because they are literally like 6-foot spiders.
There's the Flesh Warp, which is just almost an abomination of grossness. The Galoma, which is another one which is hard to describe. It's almost like some kind of demon horse.
It's like a xenomorph meets a demon horse. The Galoma that's another one. I love the Galoma and the Anati, but the Galoma is so cool.
Yeah.
People should definitely check that artwork out.
There's also the Poppet, which is becoming increasingly more popular. That's just playing a playable puppet. There's the Shisk, which overall look humanish, but they have almost porcupine-like spikes. And the Strix, which kind of seem to be sort of a harpy-like human form overall, but large wings and sort of bad dispositions. But then Pathfinder also has a couple of versatile heritages that you mentioned, which are sort of extra ancestries that you can attach and have like a little bit of one of the normal ancestries and then a little extra of this one. So one that I know of is the Damphir, which are like little vampires. The Aphorite, which can make you half angel. Duskwalker, which half zombie. Is that fair to say?
A Duskwalker they're like half ghost, would be a better approximation of it.
Okay. And then there are some elementals, Ifrit, Oread, Sylph, and Unadine, which are for fire, earth, water and air. Yep. So yeah, those are a couple of the big ancestry racial differences between Dungeons and Dragons and Pathfinder. You're going to get pretty unique experiences with both, but like how would you describe your relationship with the ancestry that you choose in Dungeons and Dragons compared to playing ancestry in Pathfinder?
I think in D&D it's very one and done is kind of the way it makes you feel. Like I said, there's a couple things like at certain levels you get to be able to do, a couple extra features, but it's really not that much. But essentially it's like you pick it and then that's it. Like that's how the world perceives you. And there isn't really any kind of like extra
benefit.
Yeah, there really isn't any extra benefit. There's nothing bonus. There's nothing to like add to your character as you go down the line in D&D. It's just like, okay, you want to play a human, you're a human, you can describe how you look, and then you move on from there. So that's kind of where it ends. Like the character creation to your character when it comes to race is done once you select it.
Yeah. Whereas with the Pathfinder ancestries, you continue to gain feats as you level up. I forget exactly at which levels you typically get one. There's a formula.
There's a formula. Yeah, I'm like, is it every other level? Yeah.
But you might also benefit from the heritage, the versatile heritage feats that you choose, depending on which heritage. So like, I know that there's one for dwarfs where their heritage lived in the Arctic, so you have fire resistance. Or ones that live deep in the ground, so instead of low light vision, you have dark vision. Things like that. So there is definitely a mechanical aspect to the game, but it does keep coming back as you level up.
Yeah. I think that would be like the best way to describe it is that in Pathfinder 2e, when you and I could make both a naughty ranger And by the time we got to level 20, they would look like completely different Anati and also completely different Rangers, most likely.
So then the next part of creating a character in Pathfinder is the background, which I saw that D&D has too. With Pathfinder, you choose 2 ability boosts, a trained skill, a lore, and then again, you get a feat. What do you get when you choose a background in D&D?
So in D&D, you get 2 skill proficiencies, some tools that kind of go along with the background, possibly languages that would associate with that, or you get to pick language based on what you're doing, and then some equipment. And the equipment is usually used as kind of a way to add flavor to your backstory. It's like, you know, you were a soldier, so you have a broken sword or like a beautiful knife, or maybe, you know, a deck of cards or something like that. So things that you can, it's essentially like used to create situations for you to role play in downtime.
So there are, by my count, 103 in D&D, and Pathfinder, there's 133 basic ones, 61 just for the adventure paths, and 13 by Pathfinder Society, as well as 73 region-specific ones, which take place in the world of Galarian. So that's a pretty big difference. So what's the role that backgrounds play for D&D?
Yeah, like I said, I think it's just that. I think it's just for setting up your backstory and kind of creating some flavor there. It definitely doesn't have the same impact that you have in Pathfinder 2e, which is probably why there aren't as many. Nearly a third.
With Pathfinder, it definitely is more of the one and done, like you explained, because you just get the benefits at the very start of character creation. You don't continue to get feats based off of your background. But the level of choice with the Pathfinder backgrounds means that you can have just about anything that I can think of as a background, and have it give you a mechanical benefit to your character throughout the entire progression of the game.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think one important thing that we don't have listed, but we probably should talk about, because you mentioned the ability boost, which you and I know are very important, but you know, what does that mean in character creation?
Oh, gosh.
Because in D&D, character creation, when you're doing your hit points, well, not your hit points, excuse me, when you're doing your ability scores, you have a couple things that come from your race and your class that are +2s or +1s that'll let you know what it is. And then from that point on, you just select, you can roll your D6s, or you can do what's called a point buy, which you get like 27 points. And then you can, you know, add in based on how many points you have left into different areas of your abilities. Or you can do what's called a standard array, which you just select, I don't know the exact numbers, but it's like 15, 14, 13, 12, 10,
right,
something like that. And yeah, but that's very different than the way that 2e has tackled ability boosts.
Yes, I totally should have mentioned that. You're right. The ability boost system in Pathfinder 2e is also sort of a point buy system, but each ability boost gives you 2 points to your ability modifier, which are the same between D&D and Pathfinder, of strength, dexterity, wisdom, intelligence, charisma, and Constitution, yes. So each ability boost gives you a +2 up to 18, and each 2 points essentially counts as 1 point towards your modifier, which is, the modifier is what you really use in 2nd edition. You don't really touch the ability score. I have a little rant about that. I really wish it could have been simplified to just be the +1 for the modifier, but that's neither here nor there. So each ability boost that you get gives you a +1. So you're getting an ability boost at your ancestry. You're getting 2 ability boosts at your background. Actually, with ancestries, usually you get between 1 and 2 ability boosts and a flaw, depending on the kind of character you choose. Humans famously get 2 ability boosts and no flaw, because we're super duper special. And then, so at this point, you have already made 3 big mechanical choices, not including the feats that the ancestries in the class gain you just by choosing your ancestry and background. Sorry. So yeah, that's how the character creation differs. There are rules so that you can make dice rolls, in Pathfinder Second Edition, totally bypassing the boosts. But for me, I personally like using the boosts. I think it's a very simplified way to create a character because it's just like 1 point, 1 point, 1 point, and you know what you're going to get at the end.
Yes. Yeah, it definitely makes it easier. But I mean, it also goes to show the benefit of picking a background. And of course, not everybody does min-maxing, but I think it helps you kind of outline, oh, okay, when I have 280, now I have some options. I don't just have to always be bounty hunter all the time or always be a hunter all the time, whatever it is that you're looking for.
Yeah. And most of the ability boosts or the ability boosts that you get from your background, at least, there's still choice in those ability boosts. There's usually you can choose between 1 or 2 ability boosts as a requirement. And then there's a free ability boost, which is one that you can choose whenever. So yeah, those are big choices to make in Pathfinder. But the next biggest one is the class. So tell us a bit about how classes work in D&D.
Yeah, so class is kind of how you set up what you're going to play for the most part. When you pick your class in D&D level 1, typically you don't know what your subclass is going to be. And subclasses are something that come in when typically at 3rd level. I think clerics get theirs at first, and then start to go to a specialized kind of class character. But yeah, classes, they come in as they give you your prime abilities. They help you with specific kinds of saving throws. They tell you what armor and weapons you're going to be proficient in. And then sometimes they'll give you specific skills, like a rogue we know is going to be able to use thieves' tools and be proficient in stealth and sleight of hand. And then, yeah, this is where your hit die comes in D&D. This is where you're going to get your first, I think, D6 still for wizards.
Every time I hear about that, I'm always a little bit confused about how it works. So is this a roll you make to build your hit points?
No. So thankfully, because this would be awful, thankfully your first one is maxed.
Okay.
And then the way that it's set up now is that you can either roll for it for your next one, or you can take an average. And so like D&D Beyond is what most people use. And so I think a lot of people will just use the average. That way, when you level up, it just automatically gives you that number, and it's still plus your con score for your hit die. But yeah, so it's always going to start with 12 hit points plus their con. A fighter's always going to start with 10 plus their con, etc.
Mm-hmm. But there could be variation, because if you choose the rolling technique, at least, you might gain a level and roll a 1, and that's all the hit points you'll get.
Yes. So yeah, once you start leveling up, you can do that. And I think a lot of people, because that's such a devastating thing, I do think a lot of people kind of go with the rule of like, if you roll a 1, we'll just roll again. But yes, essentially what it is whatever you roll on the die plus your con score, that's your new hit points for the next level.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah.
With Pathfinder, there are basically the exact same things that you mentioned. I'd say that the key ability replaces the prime ability, the key ability being which of the ability scores your class is most going to benefit from. For instance, strength or constitution for a fighter. And these are basically the ones suggested you max out, though there isn't any set rule saying that you have to max out the key ability. It's just which one you're going to benefit from first. There's also proficiency with saving throws. Some classes are more proficient with fortitude, reflex, and will.
Yeah.
With fortitude or will saves, not as proficient with reflex. Some are better with reflex and will, etc., etc. Pathfinder also has weapon and armor proficiencies, where you might be proficient with martial weapons, but not simple weapons, or proficient in simple weapons, but not proficient in martial weapons, things like that. And again, yeah, also the skills. You have a set number of skills that your class is going to be very proficient in, but you also get some free skills that you get to choose. A big difference is that the hit points for a Pathfinder class are set. You're always going to get the bonus of however many hit points your class allows, adding to your hit point total. So it just keeps growing and growing and growing. Pathfinder also has class feats, and this is the real meat and potatoes of your character build. You're going to get class feats a lot more often. The class feats are the real meat and potatoes of your character build, because you're not just going to get class feat at first level. You're going to get it many levels afterwards, and the direction that you choose for your class is not going to determine where you go. You might start off with, if you're a fighter, for example, specializing in ranged weapons, but later in the game, when you level up, you can switch your class feat so that you become more proficient with martial weapons or unarmed attacks. So there aren't, as there was in first edition, so-called feat trees, where you had to choose a feat if you wanted to get better at something. There are still definitely feat progressions where if you want to keep on getting better at a certain thing in your class, there's a specific feat that you can choose to do that. But I think it allows more variation with a class build overall.
Yeah. And I think it also gives you options to kind of like, okay, like as opposed to having a subclass in D&D, you can have sort of an archetype, or you can see like, all right, yeah, I'm gonna play a druid and I want to play a wild shaping druid. So I can follow this progression of feats, of class feats, to be able to get better and better monsters that it can turn into, and, you know, eventually get to like the dinosaurs and the dragons and the kaiju. And yeah, so it changes it that way, but I think it's just one more thing that kind of adds to that same customization. When you level up in 5e, you get, like I said, you get your subclass, and then there really isn't too much variation. Sometimes you have like a wizard will have like, what school of magic do you want to study? A fighter will like start to specialize in a certain type of fighting. And then depending on their subclass and the levels that they get, they can kind of move that around a little bit. But yeah, it's definitely not the same level of customization as you get higher up.
So that brings us to the classes that are the same with both of them. Both of them have barbarians, bards, clerics, druids, fighters, monks. D&D calls it the paladin. Pathfinder calls it a champion. Then there's rogues, rangers, sorcerers, wizards. And then the artificer kind of seems to serve as both the Pathfinder's inventor and alchemist class in one, almost. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's pretty close. The inventor is definitely more... so like the artificer is closer to the inventor, I would say, than the alchemist.
Okay.
Yeah, just from what I know about the inventor.
Yeah.
But the alchemist, I don't think there's anything in D&D 5e that's like the alchemist at all, actually.
Pretty unique class.
Yeah.
The alchemist, for those of you who aren't familiar with the term, deals with mixing chemicals, creating a lot of bombs, potions, and was introduced as one of the core classes to Pathfinder in second edition.
Yeah.
So what other classes does D&D have that's unique to it?
There really aren't a lot. Warlocks and blood hunters. And warlocks are kind of like... I don't really like saying this, but they're kind of like a witch in Pathfinder 2e in the sense of like, they both have patrons and they both can do hexes. And that's about where it ends. The warlock is more similar to some of the other newer classes that are coming up specific to Pathfinder, like the summoner and the magus, where you only get a couple of spell slots and they always level up, and then you kind of have certain things that you can just do all the time. And then the blood hunter is, I believe, an official D&D class now, but it's something that was created by Matthew Mercer from Critical Role. And you kind of you do blood magic, and that one's probably closely related, again, vaguely related to a magus, and that you're combining the two things, like being a martial fighter, but also kind of doing a little bit of magic stuff. But they are completely different classes. That's about where it ends for those two. And then everything else that they have that's unique is basically a subclass to the main classes.
Right.
Outside of that,
Pathfinder also has the investigator. You mentioned the magus and the witch. Magus kind of being a mix between spellcaster and martial. Oracles, summoners, swashbucklers, and gunslingers. And then coming out, there are also going to be psychics, and I'm going to butcher the word, but Thaumaturge. It's spelled really weird. But they're going to specialize with magic items. So is there any word about more classes, big classes coming for D&D?
Yeah, that I'm aware of, no. But like I said, a lot of theirs comes from subclasses. So like a swashbuckler, people who play 5e will be like, oh, well, I have a swashbuckler, but it's actually a rogue subclass.
Okay.
And I think even a gunslinger is another one that I don't know if it's official in D&D, but they are in D&D 5e. But that's another one that was created by Matthew Mercer.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, so that's something that I feel like is a fighter or was kind of molded as a fighter subclass. But yeah, so it gets a little tricky because that's like a lot of times you'll see like, oh, this is a very interesting thing. You know, it's kind of unique in that way, but it is a subclass of something else. So for those first 3 levels, you're still kind of playing the base character.
Gotcha. So tell us a bit more about the subclasses, because in my research, and I should have said this at the start, I've never actually played Dungeons and Dragons 5e, so everything that I could get is from internet research. So Navaar is definitely pulling the lion's share of weight with D&D knowledge. Subclasses seem to be where the real meat of a class is. I couldn't find out exactly how many D&D has because they were locked behind D&D Beyond's paywall, but
It's a lot.
Anytime that I watch a video from a D&D specific content creator, the subclass seems to be where the most class variation comes from. So tell us a bit about that.
So yeah, like I said, this is kind of where you start to separate yourself from the pack, right? So if you were playing, let's say we had a party of 4 all fighters, they may have different weapons that they start out with, but they all can only do the same things. It's not until you reach that 3rd level that you start to specialize. So once you start specializing, that's when you can kind of follow that branch, and you get special feats that go along with it as you level up. So yeah, so you'll see like a wizard, you know, we all know wizards they have their different schools of magic, right? There's the conjurers and the transmuters and things like that. There's subclasses for a wizard in D&D. So I mentioned being a blade singing wizard. What that means is like you are typically an elf who can specialize in something called the blade song, where you can use martial weapons. You get an increase to your AC. You can still cast spells, and you can fight with a sword pretty well. Depending on what you do, you can get your AC, and this is going to sound really low for Pathfinder people, but you can get your AC up to like 22, 24 at
those sound like rookie numbers to me.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But I mean, you know, most like a high level barbarian in 5e, even with magic items, is like 20, 21 AC typically.
Wow.
Yeah, that's kind of where it maxes out. So you don't get a lot of boost to your AC in 5e. So yeah, a blade singer can do that. They can do this blade song, and they can, you know, give yourself haste and blur and all this other stuff, and you kind of get to that point. But yeah, so same thing, clerics. When clerics get their subclass at 1st level, because they have to pick their domain. They have to pick their domain. So you pick your domain, and that is what sets you on the path. And a lot of times for spellcasters, it's like you can get these spells easier, or you can only select from this spell list, that kind of thing. Martial classes, it's like, are you better with ranged weapons or close hand or things like that? The warlock lets you, like, do you want more spells? Do you want to have a specialized familiar that can also be invisible? Or do you want a hexblade, like a specialized weapon that can never be taken away from things like that? So yeah.
So where do people get the the subclasses more? Are they from the adventures? Are they all in the player handbook? Are they scattered around?
Everything, like it's kind of scattered around. So you have your base player's handbook, which is going to have its own list of subclasses. I think, don't quote me on this, but it would be anywhere from like 4 to 8, depending on the class that you're going with in like the main player's handbook. And then as they put out new supplements, they add new subclasses. And so basically you'll just get like the blurb of like, okay, at 3rd level you get this, at 5th level you get this, at 7th level you get this, and so on and so forth. But you're mostly going to find it there. A lot of people use D&D Beyond the same way Pathfinder players use Pathbuilder or Wanderer's Guide or Archives of Nethys. But in that sense, that's where a lot of times you can just kind of go through the list of like, you don't have to look up a specific book. If you have access to it, you can just get all the subclasses you need. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah. But a lot of them, I mean, I don't think they come out specifically for modules. They don't have adventure paths. They have modules. And I don't think that they have specific subclasses in those. I could be wrong, but I don't think that they do. I think they make specific campaign setting guides and then add new stuff into those. Is kind of where it goes. Or they'll make like just a supplement of like, you know, we've been screwing up for a long time and making some racist stuff, so we're going to make Tasha's guide so you can just undo all of that.
Right.
And be happy.
Okay. So In a similar vein, Pathfinder has archetypes and dedications. You can absolutely play a class from start to finish and do no extra variation, but especially for players who've done it played a lot, restarted campaigns a lot, the dedications are where instead of just playing, for instance, a straight barbarian, as long as you have the necessary prerequisites, every even level, I want to say, a dedication is where you can choose another one of the classes to take at the same time. So you could be a barbarian swashbuckler or a barbarian magus, something like that. But then there are also 108 archetypes, which in those same even level slots are unique, I guess I have to say subclass to differentiate from just saying archetype again, but they provide their own set of unique archetype feats instead of the class feats at each even number level. So there's stuff like wrestler archetype,
which I know a lot of D&D fans wish they had a wrestler. Not to throw shade at all, but it's just one of those things that, like, I've heard many people say, like, I just want to do this without having to homebrew it. And I think, this is a way that Pathfinder has solved that situation.
Let's look at the list. There's like the Hell Knight. That was those are very popular. Mauler, Rune Scarred, Scout. You can even be a Rulelord at some point. And some of these archetypes are granted from Pathfinder Society or AP specific. So if we take those ones out, then there's 84 general archetypes to choose from. So it does sound in that regard, D&D has Pathfinder be quantity wise, but what would you say is the big difference between the D&D ones and the Pathfinder archetypes?
So here's where it gets a little bit tricky, especially when you start talking about multi-classing. So typically a martial character can't do more than one attack until they reach 5th level. That's when most martial classes will get their second attack. So in their action, they're only hitting one time, which Pathfinder players know you have 3 actions to do whatever you wish to do with varying penalties. So when you multi-class in D&D, depending on when you do it, you run the risk of prolonging that time. When I first played D&D 5e, I created a ranger whose subclass was called a Gloomstalker, which was a really cool subclass. It actually gave me, like, I could be invisible anytime I was in complete darkness. I had dark vision. I could do like specific spells, and I got a free, like, basically sneak attack damage on my first attack in the round. And I had a bonus to my initiative. So a lot of cool things. I was a 5th level character. I did my first 3 levels that might not be correct, but I did basically 3 levels in Ranger and then 2 levels in Fighter. Mm-hmm. And so I had some cool 2 levels of Fighter stuff, and I had my cool 3 levels of Ranger stuff. But the Barbarian, my best friend, was a 5th level character, all Barbarian. He could attack twice. I can only attack him once as the same level, because at 5th level, I wasn't a 5th level ranger. So I had to wait basically 2 more levels to get a second attack.
Oh.
And that's kind of where it gets a little bit tricky. One of my friends runs a podcast that they play 5e, and almost everybody's a multi-class in there. Mm-hmm. And it's tough. It's weighing that risk and the cost.
Right.
When it comes to that. Yeah. But I think, just the subclasses, they do what's called Unearthed Arcana, where they play test new subclasses all the time. Mm-hmm. And depending on, I'm assuming, the results of what people like, they turn those into subclasses, official subclasses in supplement books. And so you can see there's a lot of interesting things. You could be like a wild magic barbarian. So like when you rage, you can set off a wild magic table. You can be, there's, some variations, essentially like a lot of crazy stuff that you could pick, and it kind of gives you just different options there. But it all follows that same formula that I specified before of, like, you don't get that until 3rd level, and then you kind of have to follow the path that it gives you after that. And it's not options, it's just these are the things you get at these levels.
Right. Okay. So you mentioned the actions, and I guess that's a good time to break into, like, the difference between some of the play style between D&D and Pathfinder 2nd edition. 2nd edition famously, as you said, has 3 actions, where as long as you have the action economy to do an action, which are all marked by either 1 up to 3 kind of diagonal or diamond-shaped boxes, you can do it in whatever order you want. Attacks take a multiple attack penalty, -5 for the second attack and -10 There are ways to mitigate that with items and spells and other bonuses. But in any variation, you can do those 3 actions. There are a lot of these actions are granted by the feats that you choose, giving you unique actions to your class. And then there are also, for lack of better words, standard actions such as stride, which is move, strike, which is to attack, get stand up, go prone, things like that. So how did the actions in combat work for D&D?
So one way that differs a lot is that you have a move action that you can break up and move around your entire turn. So I can, for instance, in D&D, move 15 feet, shoot, do a bonus action, and then move another 15 feet. So their movement is kind of free. It's freer than Pathfinder 2e in that way. But then you get your single action, which depending on what you're doing is typically like attack once or attack twice if you have 2 attacks at 5th level or whatever. Or, cast a spell if it's a single action spell. Grapple, kind of those same things, shove. And then bonus actions are like a single free action you can use. And depending on, this is kind of where you can get a little bit customized based on your subclass. Like rogues can use as a bonus action, they can hide, they can dash, they can disengage. And so let's say a big difference when it comes to actions is that in D&D 5e, not everybody can do an attack of opportunity if you have a melee weapon, or you can do a melee attack. So, in that same scenario, let's say I moved 15 feet up to somebody, struck them once, and then moved away, they could do an attack of opportunity. As a rogue, I could just bonus action disengage and then move away without taking an attack of opportunity. And so it kind of breaks it up into that movement action, bonus action. Your speed can get reduced based on certain things, like if you're in difficult terrain or if you have to stand up, like let's say you got knocked prone, you reduce your speed to half speed. But it always follows that formula. I have 60 feet of movement in a turn because I can fly. That's your movement for the turn, but you only get your 1 action and your 1 bonus action.
Okay. And then D&D still has a set initiative, whereas with Pathfinder, you can use any of the skills at the GM's discretion for initiative. Usually it's perception, and we'll go over skill checks more in just a bit. But does having that set initiative seem to be more beneficial in D&D?
It's only beneficial to high dex characters because that's where you get your initiative bonus too. Yeah. So your monks and your rogues, they're happy with it. Some fighters, some rangers are happy with it, but everybody else is kind of, not going to have much of a bonus to that. Most people won't have the proficiency to it or the dex stuff. Like a wizard's probably going to dump dex, so they're not caring about their initiative. So, it really removes that ability to kind of jump ahead and set something up in D&D, depending on what you roll.
So they'll almost always be last in initiative order, it sounds like.
Yeah, unless everybody else rolls like crap. Yeah, it's pretty much.
Whereas perception continues to increase naturally in Pathfinder as you level up. But as I said, depending on the circumstance, the GM might allow you to make another type of skill check to have for your initiative. So you could be climbing, and so they might have athletics be the initiative, which would give marshals a big boost to initiative order than others. But then you might have be one. You could even have diplomacy or intimidation be used for perception, depending on what you're doing in that particular scenario. So to me, that seems like it gives a lot more possible variation for initiative.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in my home game, because like I said, I do play Pathfinder 2e, I've definitely used different things for different people, especially once we're in exploration mode and kind of just going through. Some people are looking around doing perception. Some people are just trying to like make sure everybody else is staying quiet, etc. So yeah, I think it makes it more specific to the encounter than just who has the fastest reflexes.
Right. So next big thing is magic. In Pathfinder 2nd edition, each spell has a set cost action. Generally, it's 2 actions for just about any spell, but some only cost 1, some cost 3, some can vary between 1 and 3, depending on how much you wanted to use them. But before we get too much into that, tell me, how does magic work in D&D?
Yeah, so basically spells cost time. So some spells are bonus actions, some are reaction spells like a counterspell. And like in a counterspell in D&D, you can just do it as long as you basically are counterspelling at a higher level, or you can roll a high enough Arcana check to beat their DC. Or it might take a full action, which again still leaves you your bonus and your move action. And then some things are longer, like a spell you wouldn't use in combat. So basically things that would take like a minute, or other spells that you can do cast as a ritual, which is basically you have to do a minimum of 10 minutes to do it. And I think there might even be longer rituals than that. But essentially, yeah, it's just based on the time that they say it's required to do that. Cantrips are still a thing in D&D 5e, and I don't think that everybody's cantrips auto level, but certain subclasses have cantrips that auto level, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah, because that's a big feature of second edition now, is that cantrips auto level with class that you pick. So any cantrips that you pick, cantrips will scale as you continue to level up. But you can also heighten spells. And heightened spells means that you can put a spell into a higher level spell slot and it'll have more power, more oomph to it. Does D&D have a similar kind of mechanic?
Yes, I think, but not all spells, but yes, you can. Certain spells you can do that, and it'll give you like a higher, basically just add dice to it depending on how many spell levels you increase.
Okay.
But not I don't think it's as many spells. But yeah, it is possible in certain cases.
Yeah. I couldn't even begin to count how many spells there are in either edition. There's entire decks of cards that Paizo makes for the spells. So there's a lot for both of them. So I don't think that there's any difference in the variety of magic that you can cast. They both use spell slots, which I think in both editions I find to be kind of confusing, but I'm a martial player. I don't deal with that stuff most of the time. But then there's also similarly lines, cones, areas of effect spells. So a lot of similarity. So what would you say are the big differences between D&D and Pathfinder 2e magic?
I think that's tough. I would say like really it comes down to the action economy, because it's just a matter of what you can do once you're done. And so, I would say in the same sense of like in a Pathfinder 2e spell that costs 3 actions, that same spell would just be a regular action for D&D. I mean, you could still do your bonus action and your movement, and that might be where it's like the biggest thing. But outside of that, I mean, you have a lot of stuff that's going to be similar. Your fireballs and your magic missiles and things like that all come from the same SRD. But I think when it comes down to just outside of that, it's just kind of a creativity thing. I think this is probably where you can stack up like a D&D 5e wizard against a Pathfinder 2e wizard a little bit easier and not feel as much pain as like letting a Pathfinder 2e fighter fight a D&D fighter, just because the action economy is king, and that change and that ability to just unleash a certain amount of things is so huge. So yeah.
So a big difference that I've always seen with D&D and Pathfinder is D&D uses advantage and Pathfinder has these things called hero points. Tell me about what advantage is.
Yeah. So advantage basically allows a player to re-roll or to roll 2 dice and take the higher number. And then there's also disadvantage, which, you roll 2 dice to take the lower. What I think this is actually closer to in Pathfinder, because hero points is essentially that. But I think what this allows you is closer to is like circumstance bonuses in Pathfinder 2e, because essentially what it's saying is like you're in an advantageous situation, so you have a higher chance of success now. If I was running a game in Pathfinder 2, I would do that same thing. Like, oh, okay, yeah, you have more things going for you. You're going to get a +4 to this roll. But yeah, advantage is essentially used like that. And so where you have a mechanic that's similar to a hero point is what's called inspiration. So similarly to that, like if a character does, let's say you have like really good role play, or a character does like a creative way to overcome the GM's obstacles, or found a creative way to like do something to take out the monster, something like that, then you could grant the player inspiration, and then they could use that in a moment of stress to be like, okay, I need to re-roll this. Where inspiration doesn't come into line is like you can't just use it to have a heroic overcoming of death. So yeah, but advantage is essentially allowing somebody to roll 2 and then take the highest.
Okay. And with a hero point, you don't get to take the highest. You can use a hero point just to re-roll, which you're probably going to save for critical failures when you really need something to succeed. The other bonus of a hero point, rules as written at least, is that you can recover from death. In the death and dying rules, when you get to dying 4, then you're dead. But you can use a hero point or all of the hero points that you have, depending on how many you have, to recover instantly to 0 and be stabilized. So essentially keeping you from that dying effect. You always get a hero point at the start of each game, not at the start of each scenario or new level, but at the start of each new session. So when do you gain advantage and inspiration in D&D?
So outside of like stuff that's built into a mechanic, it's almost entirely up to the GM.
Mm-hmm.
That's who decides whether or not you get advantage or whether or not you get inspiration. You know, some people might homebrew something else into place or whatever, but that's typically where it happens. And then outside of that, you can do certain things to gain advantage as well, because certain classes like a rogue, they can do sneak attack anytime they have advantage. So, you know, if you're standing up and the person you're attacking with a melee, and you're attacking somebody with a melee weapon and they're prone, you have advantage on that attack.
Mm-hmm.
Because basically you're in an advantageous position. I think they use advantage for flanking as well,
mm-hmm.
which is kind of OP. I mean, if your team works together,
yeah,
it really can set you up pretty bad. But yeah, so there's mechanical ways to gain advantage that a player can activate. But for the most part, like any kind of gifted advantage is always going to come from the GM.
Right. Okay. There are similar bonuses in Pathfinder for sure. Flanking, you can get a +2 to your attack rolls. They're much more situational though. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, one thing we didn't talk about too is the difference in criticals.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And so there's a lot of things that you can do in Pathfinder 2e that give you like a +1 or a +2. And you might look at that and go like, that's nothing. Like, what difference does that make? The difference it makes is that anytime you roll 10 or higher over their AC or difficulty, you have done a critical success.
Yeah.
Which, you know, is double damage and all that other stuff that goes into it. Sometimes certain weapons have different effects. So, yeah.
Yep. And when you get a nat 20, you go up a stage of success, which there's reasons for that rather than going straight to a critical. Or if you roll a natural 1, you go down a stage, which in both of those cases almost always results in a critical success and a critical failure respectively. But yeah, the critical levels of success are a big difference. So how do criticals work in D&D?
Yeah, so criticals in D&D, I believe the rules as written, I believe, is you roll double the dice. So all the dice you roll an extra one with it.
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to just rolling a number and multiplying by 2. And you know, some people like just multiplying by 2 instead of rolling more dice. But I'm pretty sure the rules as written is basically if you are rolling, you know, 2d12 for this, you're going to roll 4d12. And let's say you have like, you know, a special weapon that also adds a d6, then you roll 2d6 along with those 4d12. So that's kind of where it breaks down.
Right. And for Pathfinders, like critical success levels, sometimes there are unique features of whatever you're rolling against that'll be described for your level of success. So for example, there are basic saving throws, and both of them have reflex, fortitude, and will, which are the big 3. They also both use the 6 ability scores that we talked about. And then D&D has passive checks, while second edition, Pathfinder second edition, has DCs, which is 10 plus whatever your score is in that skill or saving throw. So where the basic saving throw comes in for Pathfinder second edition is that when you make a basic saving throw, if you are doing damage to another creature, if their saving throw is a critical failure, they'll take double damage. If it's a failure, they'll take full damage. If it's a success, they'll take half damage. And if it's critical success, they'll take no damage. So that applies to both creatures and to players. So the reverse is also possible too when you're dealing damage. If they fail their roll, you'll do that much more to them. What kind of bonuses is the only bonus for a saving throw in a critical save in D&D just you get the save extra hard, or is there an extra level of success to critical rolls?
Yeah, criticals, successes and failures don't make a difference. 5e kind of did away with a lot of it. Like you can't, like even if you critically succeed on a skill check, technically it's not like a crit. It's just a success. And I think the same goes for saving throws. If you succeed, you take half damage or no damage. If you fail, you take all the damage of whatever is being thrown at you. And so that's really the only difference. The other difference, just as a clerical thing, is that while there are the same save, essentially reflex, fort, and will are called Dex, Constitution, and Wisdom saves in Dungeons and Dragons 5e. They just use the base skill name, where they come from. But yeah, so it's the same skill. Not to confuse it. I just, in case somebody's looking for it. But yeah, criticals don't do anything different to that. So there's no extra impact.
Okay. Then with some of the spells in Pathfinder 2nd edition or special abilities, there might be varying levels of success with a critical success or failure. So let's see.
Yes, like this is where like conditions come into play in Pathfinder. Yeah, because a lot of conditions will have a number attached to it, and that is kind of like what you take as a penalty, typically a penalty, and kind of what level you're starting at when you take that penalty.
Yeah. So yeah, Pathfinder 2nd edition has these conditions, and like you said, when someone makes a roll, it could affect the level of condition or the type of condition that you get. So if you are trying to save yourself from being grabbed, for instance, that's the one I was trying to think of. If you critically succeed, you get totally out of the grab. If you succeed, I think it makes it a little bit easier to get out of the grab. Whereas if you fail, you are grabbed. But if you critically fail, you are then restrained rather than just normally grabbed. So that stuff happens with spells, with class feats, with ancestry feats, where depending on what you're doing, the level of success in your dice roll can vary the outcome a lot. But you don't make the ability checks rolls so much anymore at all, really. You don't hear make a Constitution saving throw or a Wisdom saving throw in Pathfinder. You do rolls against your skills or reflex, fort, and will. So what are the saving throws that you have in D&D?
Yeah, so same. You'll do all three. So the Dex, Constitution, and Wisdom saving throws. But then also, you'll have an intelligence saving throw that you have to do, or a wisdom saving throw, things like that as well. And then in that same vein, you'll still do skill checks. So if you have to climb a wall, you still got to do your athletics or jumping over stuff. Acrobatics, stealth is a big one. Arcana, when you're trying to look into magic, history or nature, religion, things like that. Medicine is there, and that usually what I've seen it used for typically is just like to see if you can even determine what's wrong with the person medically. Perception, of course. And then 5e also has what's called passive skills. So they'll do like passive perception, passive insight, and passive investigation, I believe. And that's basically just like when you're not in a sticky situation and you walk into a room, what are the things that you notice? And that number for 5e can get really high depending on like the extra feats you take and stuff. Because as you level up, you can either increase your ability modifiers, your ability scores, or you can take a feat at like every 4th level. And so there are certain feats you can take which can make like your passive perception like a 30, which in 5e is godlike.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
They do seem to share a lot of the same skills between them: athletics, acrobatics, stealth, arcana. There's history in D&D and society in Pathfinder, nature, religion, medicine, perception, survival, deception, intimidation, performance. D&D has persuasion, Pathfinder is diplomacy, then D&D has sleight of hand, and Pathfinder has thievery. And yeah, like you mentioned, you have insight and investigation and animal handling that are unique to D&D, whereas in Pathfinder you have crafting, lore, and occultism, and then secret checks that the Pathfinder GM will sometimes make. What a secret check is if there is something that the character shouldn't know if they succeeded or failed with. So a knowledge check, for example. That's a way to prevent metagaming, is that the GM will make the check for the player, then give the player the information. So the player can never be 100% sure if the knowledge that they have is accurate, but it's the information that they have to go on. Whereas if they do the roll in the open and they get a natural 1, they know whatever information the GM gives them is BS. So how does that work differently with D&D and their investigation or lore checks?
I think like when that might be similar is like if as a GM you might set a 5e GM, you might set a DC for something.
Mm-hmm.
And then not, the player doesn't know what the DC is. So then even if you're using their passive score, it's still the information that you're giving them. And sometimes, or another way is like, I've seen this or done this myself. A 5e GM will just roll a die and not say anything about what they're rolling. And then like, what's your passive perception? Okay.
And then everyone's like, oh crap.
Oh no. Yeah. Yeah. Or sometimes players will be like, well, hang on, wait, like, do they get a surprise round? Cause I have this passive perception score of this thing. So that's kind of when it comes up. I do think that having the investigation and insight that D&D has wrapped up into perception, I think kind of makes that easier, because that I've seen it happen in games, and I've been a part of it happening in games, of like being a point of contention of like, this should be a perception that I'm rolling right now and not an investigation, because one's wisdom, one is intelligence. Right. And so it's like, it came up for me when we were doing our first check for traps. Right. And I'm like, okay, well, why would, as a mechanic, why would it be investigation for rangers and rogues to check for traps when we're built to do perception checks, wisdom checks?
Yeah.
And so we ended up having to go into the rule book for that one. But like, yeah, I'm not a really big rules lawyer, but it's just like, I want this to make sense.
Right.
But I think it's, that just taking that away and being like, cause even sometimes I'm like, insight is one that I feel like I got used to using for like insight towards a person. Right. And they used to have, what was it called in Pathfinder first edition? I can't remember.
Sense motive?
Yes. Yeah. And, and so like that was more specific to a person, which I felt like that made sense as a separate skill, but having them all be perception, I think it makes it a little bit simpler.
Yeah. And that's what Pathfinder second edition does, is perception is the sense motive. It is the trap finder skill. It is the initiative roll very often. It's the seek
investigation
action. Yeah. So you use perception as a very overarching skill. And like I mentioned before, all of the skills continue to increase as you level up. So your perception in Pathfinder first edition, and I don't know if this is how it works in D&D, in first edition Pathfinder, if you wanted to increase your perception, you had to put a skill into it, which then made it so that you couldn't put that skill into something else. So if you wanted to increase perception, anytime that you got a new skill, you had to put it into perception. Whereas now with second edition, perception will always just level up. So you can use your skills for other things. Is it similar in D&D?
So in 5e, it's closer to the old way. So you'll have like a perception is a skill. So you can take training in perception. Only 2 classes, I believe, can get expertise. And that is the rogue and the bard. And what expertise does is basically doubles your proficiency. So proficiency in D&D 5e goes up a lot slower than it does in 2e. And yeah, so you'll like, everybody else will be rolling like a +3 to their perception, and a rogue and a bard will be rolling like a +8, +9, because they have that extra expertise if they take expertise in that skill. But it is something you have to select. It doesn't just come with your you don't get a bonus for your class or anything like that.
Right.
So.
And then there's one thing I just remembered that I neglected to mention, is that several of the actions in Pathfinder second edition are based off of a skill check. So stealth is a stealth roll, obviously, and like lock picking is a thievery check. And these are actions that you can do in combat. So they're things that you can, that as you level up your skill, will still have a big mechanical difference in combat, as well as out of combat events like trying to disable a trap outside of combat. There are thievery things that you can do in combat with different skill-based actions. So it keeps them really relevant, not just outside combat, but inside combat. And do they seem to have the same effect in combat in D&D?
Not so much. I mean, you'll still see rogues using stealth to like hide during combat because they can do that.
Mm-hmm.
For the most part, I'm trying to think athletics for grappling.
Mm-hmm.
I think, or if you're like trying to move around a tricky obstacle during combat, you might use like athletics or acrobatics. But for the most part, a lot of those skills you really won't see. Every once in a while, somebody will try to like diffuse a situation and take it from physical combat to like a social combat is what we call it in Pathfinder 2e. And you'll see like maybe an intimidation roll or persuasion roll. But outside of that, you really don't see it in combat very much. Every once in a while, I think like as free actions, people will be allowed to like, what do I know about this character? And typically that's ran as a free action in 5e.
Okay. Then there's healing, which seems to be a very unique difference between D&D. With Pathfinder, you pretty much have to do a full night rest to regain spells particularly. It's also one of the best ways to regain hit points. But you can also do medicine checks outside combat. And within combat, there's things like battle medicine, and there's one for like natural healing. But in second edition, there's also wounded and dying conditions, where for when you're dying, you try to make a save equal to the condition value of your dying value. So if you're dying 1, you make a flat check to try to be an 11. If you're dying 2, you make a flat check to try to beat a 12. The more you fail, the more that number continues to go down. Wounded, however, is when you recover from dying. You have this essentially a placeholder that if you get 2 wounded, you might instantly die later on, depending on how many times you go down. But it's one of the more complicated systems, I think, in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, but it seems to be a pretty forgiving one with the number of chances that you get to try to stave off dying. So what does D&D do with healing and dying?
So this is one of the biggest differences in the two, is that D&D, when it comes to healing, I've joked about it a lot. Of just like, can you imagine waking up in a world where like you get mauled by a monster and then you go to sleep for 8 hours and you wake up completely healed? That's D&D 5e. But yeah, so we have what's called a short rest and a long rest. And so basically a short rest, you have a set number of hit dice. Hit dice basically is like whatever your level is, that's how many hit dice you have. You can use up to your total to try to regain some health. And you just basically roll those die and gain back the number. On a short rest, you can do that. And short rest also is where some classes, but not all classes, can regain abilities, spells, things like that. But most classes have to do it on a long rest.
Mm-hmm.
And then a long rest is like 8 hours of resting. Some people are very strict and it's like you have to get 8 hours of sleep. I think rules is written is like 8 hours of just non-strenuous activity.
Mm-hmm.
With some sleep at least.
And that's how you know it's a fantasy game. Being able to get 8 straight hours of sleep.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, where monsters are lurking. And so with the long rest, that's when you just regain everything. Like you wake up, all your spell slots are back. You are completely healed of any and all damage. And yeah, it is pretty wild. And then for D&D 5e, you have, instead of dying conditions, you have death saving throws. And so you just basically roll a d20. Same thing, flat check, but you're just trying to beat a 10. It doesn't change unless, GM homebrews it. But yeah, you just roll above a 10 and you have to beat 3. So get 3 successes before you get 3 failures. If you roll a natural 20, it's automatically you're stabilized. You're back to 0 and you're just unconscious. And if you roll a natural 1, then you're donezo. Yeah. And when it comes to healing too, I think in 5e it's more spell-based. Potions are very expensive and very ineffective for what they cost. I mean, you're like a $50 potion is like a 2d4 plus 2, I think, healing.
That's not a lot.
That's not a lot.
10 max, right? Yeah, 2d4.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, max. Yeah. And for 50 gold, if I'm remembering correctly, it could be, it could be 25, but either way, that's a lot of money. And the higher level healing potions are even more expensive. Like it's a crazy scale. So yeah, so that's tough. And then of course you can use spells to heal as well. But it definitely makes it, I don't know, it's tough because it's easy to get out of dying in that sense. Really, I mean, somebody could just go and do I think that might be when a medicine check comes in. They can either like dump potion in your mouth or, do something to help stabilize you. And then you're done. You're no longer worried about it. There are spells like Healing Word, which you can just like cast from a distance to give somebody like a D4 of healing or whatever. And they're up now, right? So as long as nobody knocks them back down, but they don't have to worry about having a wounded condition to like increase or decrease the number of saves that they get. So it's pretty difficult to die in 5e in that sense, which has been, I believe, a criticism of it from fans. But yeah, it's one of those things that it definitely like really leans into the fantasy of that kind of power fantasy of like,
getting up at the last minute.
Yeah. Or just waking up and you're fine the next
and being fine.
Yeah.
For second edition, it's one of the first where I felt it's not necessary to have necessarily a dedicated healer. That there's kind of like the traditional party makeup of a tank, a diplomat, a skill monkey, and then there's a healer who their one job is after combat, heal, 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 heal. For me, it seems that in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, there's so many different ways to heal. You can have someone who's really trained in medicine and then almost never have to use magic at all. You have the alchemist who could brew healing potions at will. Then, of course, there's the cleric or the champion who could use heal spells, but also wizards or sorcerers could also use healing spells.
And druids too,
yeah. Druids. So is there that same kind of freedom if it's so difficult to die of not having to have a party healer?
No, unless something's changed recently. There's no like treat wounds skill that you can do to kind of help somebody out in that way. I think there's like herbalism kits, but I think it's still like it's so minimal. It really like it doesn't scale well at higher levels, and so you almost always need some kind of healer. Most people just either somebody will be the cleric or somebody gets made the cleric. But yeah, it doesn't have that same flexibility. And I'll just say like my home game has an alchemist, a druid, and a witch, and none of them are really tanks. Because even the druid in Pathfinder 2e is not that much of a tank. You don't get here's the difference in class. Like in 5e, let's say I turn into a bear, I get that bear's hit points, and then when the bear form dies, I go back to my normal hit points. In 2e, it's like you get temporary hit points that you add on to your already current hit points. So it's pretty hard to like at low levels to kind of tank as a druid still. And we don't have like, he can do a heal spell, but typically they just, survive combat and then they'll do treat wounds after that. Or the alchemist, because somehow she ends up playing tank a lot of times, she puts herself like in combat. And so she'll just make a healing potion at will. But those healing potions are like, God, I don't remember the number. It's like 2d8 plus 6 or something. It's
really
so
a lot. Yeah.
It's so much more. Yeah.
So that's so much about being a player that now I think it's time to give a little love to the game master or the dungeon master in DM in D&D. So I was looking over combat building, and both systems have an armor class, which is the number you have to beat to be able to hit the creature, the hit points. Some of them have temporary hit points. All creatures have a movement speed, and all of them are able to get critical hits in. But something that kind of confused me a little bit about D&D was the challenge rating and the overall numbers of building a thing. Because when I was looking over at least Icewind Dale, there were like rabbits, and they were CR1, and they had an AC of, I don't know, like 16 or something. And then there's the big baddie of the game who's like CR 17 or something like that. And then their AC is 17. Not like a huge difference. So tell us a bit about how combat building works and how you get the balance for combat in D&D.
Yeah, so basically CR, challenge rating, is essentially supposed to be used as like your typical party of 4 should have a challenge facing this CR. So if we're 4th level, a CR4 monster should give us a fair challenge in a fight. And yeah, it's tough. We talked about like how like your bonus doesn't really go that high in D&D, your attack bonus. And so like even like the highest dragons, I think is like AC 24.
Yeah. Which
and
seems
so it's
really minimal.
Yeah. And so certain classes can get pretty high up there and can, depending on how you min max and stuff like that, you can hit pretty high numbers for the most part. But that said, as you gain higher levels, like it's kind of hit and miss, honestly. Early on, CR doesn't always really line up. And I think that might just have to do with like class balancing and things like that. As you kind of mix things up, it really can just throw that number off. But where D&D differs a lot from Pathfinder is when you get to higher level CR monsters, a lot of them will have what's called lair actions. So like if they're in their lair, then their lair gets to do certain things to you too, like it releases a poisonous gas or the walls shake or whatever, like certain things happen.
Mm-hmm.
They also get what's called legendary actions. So they have a certain amount of extra attacks or extra actions that they can use on their turns that they can do. And then they have what's called legendary resistances. So in those instances where it's like a lot of the D&D 5e spells, like we talked about in saving throws, like it's save or suck. Like this is either going to work or it's not going to work very well and you're only going to half, or it's not going to work at all. And so the strategy there becomes like, okay, how do we get it to use its legendary resistances so that way we can unload big stuff on it? And a lot of times people forget because you're in the heat of combat and you're into the game, so you're stressed out. And so you're like, I got you. I'm going to put this big spell on you. And it's like legendary resistance. The spell no longer works. I succeeded as the dragon. And it's like, So yeah, that's kind of where it gets a little bit different. And it makes those big CR characters, monsters, a lot more difficult to fight because they have those things. But for the most part, it is kind of hit and miss, I'll be honest. And I don't know. I think it's tough anytime you're trying to balance combats, but especially in D&D, I've personally found when I've ran games that I've never used just one of that CR, or I've never really lined up the CR. I just kind of like looked at their hit points, looked at how many attacks they could do, and then, based on like how many people are in there, and kind of did it more around the action economy. Like I have 4 characters who can all attack one time, and this monster can do 3 attacks. And so if I put 2, that's 6 against 4 attacks, basically. And that's kind of how I would balance it more than the CR of itself.
Okay. And for GMs for Pathfinder, we use a level which has a very distinct equation to it, where you use the level of the party, and then depending on how difficult you want the scenario to be, you get a certain amount of experience points to use to build that encounter. So if you are trying to make a moderately hard scenario, you would get like 120 XP, or that's really severe. If you're trying to make a severe encounter, you'll get 128 XP, and you can spend those points to build the encounter. The cost of a monster for the XP is based on their level relative to the player. So if your player level is like 6 and a monster is 8, then a monster, that level 8 monster costs like 80 XP, I believe. Don't cite me on the exact numbers. It's late. You can look it up on Archives.
Like 60 is like the base. Like same level. You're getting 60
exactly. So if you're going to build a severe encounter at 180 XP and you have 3 60 cost monsters, that's a pretty balanced encounter for that level of severity. So that seems to me a little bit easier to figure out than CR to me at least.
Yeah, having done both, I can objectively say that Pathfinder makes it easier in that sense. But I also personally, and this is just me personally, like just not paying attention a lot of times, sometimes I just look at their monster level and then I'll just like pick however many I want. So sometimes I can create situations for myself that I probably could have balanced better, but that's just me not really paying attention to like how it's recommended to balance it. Whereas in like literally in if I could give anybody an advice for D&D 5e, I would just use CR as like a starting guideline and then balance it based on action economy.
Okay.
That's, to me, that has worked the best for making combats that feel dangerous, but are overpowered.
Yeah.
Or underpowered, I should say.
Some other rules about combat are that in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, most creatures now do not have what used to be called attack of opportunity. Well, it's still called attack of opportunity if you have that, but most creatures, if they are going to have something, is called a reaction. Attack of opportunity was very movement based. Anytime that you went next to a creature in 1st edition, anything got an attack of opportunity. That was, as common for fighters, as wizards had attack of opportunity. Every single monster had attack of opportunity. But now, most monsters in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, if they do have attack of opportunity, it's a very low amount of monsters compared to those who have other kinds of reactions, which are very situational, like depending on when they might start the action or where a character is placed. So there's a lot more freedom of movement, but I do see that there are still opportunity attacks in 5e. Is that something that everyone has?
Pretty much, yeah. Yeah, like I said, as long as you have a way to do a melee attack, you can do an opportunity attack.
Okay.
So like you won't really see wizards do it, right? Because they could, hit you with a staff or whatever, but it's completely ineffective and it would waste, possible counterspell or something like that. That's why they don't do it. But yeah, essentially, if you have something to swing, you can do an opportunity attack.
And then there's also that in Pathfinder, when you reach 0 for a creature's hit points, they're dead. The bad guys that you're fighting, you can choose to knock them out using non-lethal attacks, which is a -2 to your attack. But otherwise, once you kill them, they're dead. Does that work in D&D?
Yeah. So most of the time, the default for most tables is lethal damage, unless people call it out. There's no penalty for doing non-lethal damage. And I would say, again, like creatures die. The only times that they don't, that I've seen, is like either the DM wants, to have like last words, or the players are like, hey, once they're down, we want to like get them to, we want to interrogate them or whatever, right? So it's like, instead of like, when you ask the question like, how do you want to do this? It's not like I cut off their head. It's like, I want to like, mess them up pretty badly to where they can't fight us back anymore. And then I want to be able to like tie them up and stuff. So it kind of gives the DM can either be like, all right, well, I'll roll death saves while you try to like tie them up and heal them, or we'll just let it be.
Okay. Because that was one of the most annoying parts for me as a GM in Pathfinder 1st Edition, was that when they got to 0 HP, they weren't dead. Creatures weren't dead. Usually you would say that they're dead, but technically it wasn't until they got to so much past their dying. So that meant that players always tied up the body, recovered the creature, interrogated, and it's just like, come on, just move.
Yeah.
But yeah, anyway, so yeah, that's a lot of the mechanical differences with the two. We're going to finish off with just a little brief stuff about some of the lore between Pathfinder and Dungeons and Dragons. This is just if you're using the worlds of those systems. Both of them are, I would say, good to have your own homebrew rules for, your own homebrew worlds, though Pathfinder does seem to incorporate its world much more into its mechanics. I don't know if D&D does the same. But anyway, Pathfinder is set in the world of Golarion. Most of the action in Pathfinder takes place in a continent called Avestan. There's this big capital called Absalom, which has a monster of a lore book that just came out now, which houses something called the Starstone. In Pathfinder lore, there was a huge catastrophe called Earthfall, where comets came raining down and essentially reset the world, killing a bunch of old civilizations and adding this thing called the Starstone. And the importance of the Starstone is it had the ability to turn mortals into gods. That's where you got a big god called Eridan, who recovered the Starstone and then made Absalom out of the ocean, and it set this big, almost golden age in Golarion until he died. And no one knows how he died. But there's now a big hurricane called the Eye of Abendigo, where Eridan died, and no one knows why. But once he died, prophecy also died with him, which is why the setting for Pathfinder is called the Age of Lost Omens, because there's no more precognizance anywhere. There's a couple big things about the Pathfinder setting too, which is that they're expanding a lot. A big book that came out is the Mwangi Expanse, which is basically adding, as my old GM would compare whenever they built a setting for Pathfinders, totally not whatever. So this country is totally not Egypt or totally not
Yeah.
Rome. Mwangi is totally not Africa, but it's this giant increase in the amount of lore to Galarian, new creatures, the new ancestries that we talked about, and a whole mess of setting. There's also the first world, which was the rough draft made by the gods, and that's where fairies came from, fae folk. A lot of creatures were built in the first world, and then the gods were like, well, we don't really like this, so they just pushed it aside and made the material world, but sometimes things from the first world come into it. A Starfinder expands on the galaxy as a whole, and so you can use some of the galaxy information from Starfinder into Galarian, where there's a world of the dead. Elves actually came from a different planet originally, and then it came to Galarian through these world gates. So there's tons and tons of lore for Galarian, and each of the settings really improves upon that lore by having large world-shaping events like Rise of the Rulelords, where hugely powerful wizards went to sleep during Earthfall, but then came back, and it was up to the characters to beat them, to one of the current campaigns called Extinction Curse, which has implications all the way as far back as Eridan to why the situation is happening in the modern day. So Galarian is incorporated a lot into the adventure paths that they come out with. To my knowledge, those never made a non-Galarian setting that's officially part of the Pathfinder canon, but that's the world of Pathfinder. So tell me a bit about the world of D&D.
Yeah, so D&D, for the most part, a lot of it takes place in what's called Faerun. So Faerun, the Forgotten Realms, it's kind of like the main canonical setting for D&D. They also do have settings for a place called Eberron, which is like a more
Steampunk?
Yeah, like a steampunk age. It kind of did away with a lot of like the original racist tropes. So like orcs aren't seen as all evil, goblins aren't seen as all evil in that setting. And then they have the Dragonlance setting, which is most famous for its books, but is a campaign setting as well. They've also done some other things. And then of course, what Critical Role, has added to it and has become official. But yeah, for the most part, it's all done in Faerun. Faerun has kind of notable places in the sense of like, similar communities. There's like a place that has ice. There's the Sword Coast, which is like the pirates, and Ravenloft, I believe, is where like Curse of Strahd, which everybody and their mom is running right now. But yeah, so it's I think when you look at the map, it looks less like a map of our geological world than Galarian does, but I think there's still a lot of inspiration, if you will, that's pulled from certain places for good and for bad.
And then there are the gods of each setting. In my games, gods honestly never come up all that much, just because that's how I've run them, but there's a lot of them, and with Pathfinder, they're pretty recognizable figures. Mentioned Eridan, the first mortal turned god. There's Sarenrae, who is probably the cleric's favorite god to choose. There's Pharasma, the Lady of Graves, who decides where souls go after they die. There's the fan favorite Caden Kalian, the drunk man who went through the trials of the Starstone blackout drunk and somehow got through it and turned into a god. I don't think I've played a campaign where someone didn't choose Caden Kalian as their chaotic neutral god. There's who got like a really cool rewrite in the Mwangi Expanse. There's Nethys, a god of knowledge, who, as we'll talk about in a little bit, the Archives of Nethys is named after. And then Rovgug is maybe the unspoken biggest bad of Pathfinder, where Galarian is actually known as the Cage in intergalactic lore, because Rovgug, this creature of pure destructive power, had the battle with both the good and evil gods of Galarian, because both sides recognized how destructive this creature was. They all joined forces against Rovagug and trapped it inside the planet of Galarian. And Rovagug's influence comes out every once in a while, but it is at the moment still trapped inside of the planet. Though in Starfinder, mysteriously, the planet of Galarian has disappeared, and now there is Absalom Station in what is known as the blackout, I think. So where did Rovagug go? Who knows? But there's a lot of other gods that come up in the adventure paths. But I feel that Paizo, especially in their adventure paths, really incorporates the various religions that they've made into the game. My knowledge of D&D gods, though, is extremely limited. All I know about is Tiamat, because you got that huge, awesome $500 miniature that came out. But what other gods can you tell us about that are D&D specific?
Yeah, so there really is a ton, and it really just kind of depends on your setting. But similarly, like there's gods for everything, you know, for the forest, for war, for the sky, for the mountains. But a lot of like the popular ones are like Bahamut, which is the platinum. It's kind of like the god of the metallic dragons. Corellon, which is like the god of the elves. I think in D&D lore, he was the one that like made all of the elves. And then when Lolth separated from him and tried to like bring others to her side to take over power, that's when she became like the spider god of the drow. And Grumsh, who is like the god of the orcs. Name. Yeah, I feel like, and I could be getting this a little bit wrong, but I think Grumsh and Corellon have a big rivalry. I believe Corellon stole his eye, and that's the justification for why orcs are always going to war to prove themselves. But those are like the main popular ones. I even think that Bahamut and Tiamat are connected, if I remember correctly. Just obviously being like the polar opposites. Tiamat being the queen of dragons of the what's the word? Chromatic
versus
metallic. Yeah. But yeah, so same like in most campaigns, most people don't really do a lot with them. I personally like to incorporate deities just because I'm an atheist, and I think it's cool that there's a setting where you can make them
a known part of
the world. Yeah. So in my home game, the players can see specific things that they are doing, that the gods that they worship are doing to their environment, to their games, things like that. So
interestingly, in Pathfinder, there's an entire nation of atheists in Qadira. Atheism exists in Pathfinder, but it's more a rejection of gods than saying that they don't exist, because there's very tangible evidence that they exist in Galarian. But a cool part of the lore is that if you die atheist, you do just die, but your soul kind of turns into this grave site in the afterlife, but you do just cease to exist. They don't send you into a heaven or a hell. You'll just be done. So it's cool that they incorporated atheism as something that is still viable, and to me, I think respectful what it is, because I am too. So we could go on about setting for forever, but by now I think players, you've had a lot of information to decide. Do you want to play Pathfinder 2nd Edition? Do you want to play D&D? Do you want to play both? So a final piece is what you should know about resources going out into the future. One big thing that I love to plug is called Pathfinder Society. This is play that you can do at conventions, at local areas, where you can join up and play with complete strangers with a set character that has rules for how you build it. But you can take that character anywhere in the entire world, sit down and play at a table. Does D&D have something for that?
Yeah, it's called Adventures League, and it's very much the same. I think, they're probably built the same way, and it essentially very specific rules. You can only use certain source books, and I think like they limit it to like, you don't have to use the same source books as everybody else, but you can only use 3 official source books. And yeah, but it's very, very, very much like rules as written, but you're going to get consistent. You should get consistent, I should say. You should get consistent DMing, rules of play, like, wherever you go, you're going to find that. And same thing, I think they do it a lot at like cons and stuff like that.
Yeah. And then because we're nerds and we like to spend our money, maybe what Wizards and Paizo come out is not enough for you. So D&D has bajillion and a half third-party content things. So tell us a little bit about what they have.
Yeah, there's so much. So, DM's Guild is the drive-through RPG D&D specific website, but you can also find stuff on drive-through as well. But essentially, it's like people who have made probably higher quality D&D specific classes, magic items, rules, settings, etc., that you can go and purchase specifically from the creator. And then literally 90% of the creators that do things in TTRPGs on Twitter make something for D&D as well. And a lot of it is really cool. So that's another place too. Like if you just get involved in the community, you can see on usually any given day, somebody will be posting like, hey, I made this thing, magic items, subclasses. I have a friend who made a bunch of different Pokemon and just a bunch of crazy unhinged characters. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff out there because D&D 5e is very accessible in that way that you can and popular. So there's a lot of incentive for people to make new things for it.
Every time I see a Kickstarter, the first thing I look for is it's for 5e. It's very, very hard to find ones for Pathfinder, but they do exist. There was stuff like that came out recently. It's the Book of Leshies that's coming out by user Orphane. But probably one of the bigger ones is called the Battle Zoo Bestiaria, which is run by RPG Superstar, which is essentially a Paizo product at this point, given how many Paizo creators were involved in the decision-making process or the design process of it. But these creatures were actually submitted by the community to this contest called RPG Superstar. And then winners were chosen. Paizo designers did a lot of freelance work to make them much more balanced creatures and incorporate easily into the Pathfinder rule set. But now recently, Pathfinder has Pathfinder Infinite, which seems to be like the DM's Guild equivalent, where community members can submit their own homebrew content there, and you can either pay a set price or pay what you want. So it is growing. I would have to honestly say it's not at nearly the same level of quantity as D&D. And then if you want to go and find creators for Pathfinder to get more content for it, both have pretty sizable communities, but D&D obviously has more. With Pathfinder, you got obviously great podcasts like Secret Nerd Podcast, No Direction, No Nat Ones, How It's Played. There are a lot of channels, but what can people find for D&D?
I mean, D&D has so much. Like the big one obviously is Critical Role, which is the kind of the face of D&D right now. I think I've heard a lot of people say like they're more popular than
actual D&D.
But yeah, there's a TV show, so like a good TV show. Yeah, and then there's so many podcasts out there. Like I would venture to guess 85 to 90% of the actual play podcasts out there are D&D 5e podcasts, big YouTubers, and it makes it easier to kind of find some information of like how to play and stuff like that, tips on being a DM. And there's multiple how to be a DM podcasts as well. And then just the player base and the DM base is fairly big as well if you can find a community to jump into. But is overall much easier to find a D&D game than a new Pathfinder 2nd edition game, unless you have a group and you convince them to switch, or as I did, join Pathfinder Society, find a group of people who also like playing it, that you like playing with, and making a group that way. And then for specific content, now has something called Pathfinder Nexus, which is made by Demiplane, which is a much prettier way to read their books. It's soon going to have a character creator thing too. I already mentioned Pathfinder Infinite, which is where community can go to give you information. They have their adventure paths, their modules, Pathfinder Society, pawns, and then a big thing is the Archives of Nethys, which is a website you can go to that is completely for free and has every single rule for all of Pathfinder in it. And that is a partnership that they have worked out with Paizo. It's not a pirater putting all this information out. It's a working partnership. And every time something
new comes out, they add it to the website pretty quickly. But those are some pretty big resources for Pathfinder players. What resources Wizards of the Coast have for D&D players?
Yeah, so this is a big one, and it's actually not. I mean, they're a partner of Wizards of the Coast, but it's D&D Beyond. I believe the same team that does D&D Beyond is making Pathfinder Nexus, because they are a third-party company. But yeah, that's where most people go to create their characters, run their campaigns. I think there's like integration for Roll20, things like that. The DM Guild that we'd mentioned, where you can find a lot of that higher quality third-party, independent creator stuff. And then they make books, adventure modules typically that people get into. They had Candlekeep Mysteries, which was like a book of different mysteries that you can kind of put your players through in a specific library, but you can kind of use it anywhere. And yeah, I mean, but the D&D Beyond is like that's the big one that most people use, because it really does make things easier, because it automates a lot of stuff.
Right.
You do have to pay for it.
It's like a lot sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, if you can like pitch in with whomever runs your game to help pay it, like once they have it, they can basically put you in a campaign, and then everything they have access to, you have access to. So yeah, that's the key.
Now, is there a free resource for D&D official information?
No, there is not. Not that I'm aware of, at least. I think you can like go on their site and get like the
basic information,
the basic handbook. And even on D&D Beyond, you can get very basic, limited, free stuff, but it limits like what classes you can pick, what subclasses you can pick, even things like that. So yeah, there's no like list of rules. You can't just go on Archives of Nethys and just learn how to play the game.
So now we get into opinion territory, which is where we've tried to give you as much objective information I think is possible. We are both obviously Pathfinder players, but now we're going to talk about our overall impressions of each game. So why don't you start, Navaar? What do you think about the big differences between D&D and Pathfinder?
Yeah, honestly, I think in terms of quality of game, they're both high quality games. Like, I'm not taking anything away from either one. Pathfinder 2e is my preferred game. It's my preferred game because I enjoy the mechanics more. I enjoy feeling like an actual hero at first level, of being able to do 3 attacks and, having that action economy to have freedom and it makes you feel really cool. I also really love the character customization, because that is such a huge thing for me personally, to just like really break down how the character looks. It's so inspiring for backstory and for character growth as you're kind of going through it. And I think for me personally, it does a better job of like, this is the class I want to play, and I don't feel like I need to multi-class to get something else out of it. Like that, taking a dedication feels more like something I would do for fun than something I would need to do because I'm not satisfied with what I've got. D&D is fun. It's a fun game. It's very easy to get into 5e. It's easy to understand the rules. I think, like I said, depending on where you start, the ease of getting into them is the same for me personally. I think D&D Beyond gets a better record of that, or excuse me, D&D 5e gets a better record of that because of D&D Beyond, which is not technically a D&D Wizards of the Coast product. And so just like, I always like try to remind people that like, okay, yes, but like understand if we're talking about the specific games, it's not technically the same thing. And go jump on Path Builder and you will have the same ease of creating character. You just have more options. 5e feels restrictive to me, having played a lot of 2e, even as a GM, like just the fact that you can't really get into multiple attacks until higher levels, the lack of character customization feels really tough sometimes if you're a person who enjoys that thing like I do. And I think the biggest difference is just marketing dollars more than anything else, because in a high quality game, stakes with the same marketing dollars, I don't know. I think the race would be a lot closer personally, but it's that I don't have any empirical evidence to back that up. It's just like, I don't understand. Anytime I've ever introduced somebody to Pathfinder or just like talked about it, because I do every episode, and I've invited new people to play the game and introduced quite a few new people to it. Everybody's like, oh my God, it's amazing. The feel of pulling off big attacks and like critting a ton, and the amount of damage you roll, it's hard to beat. So yeah, I think, 5e is never going to go away, or D&D is never going to go away. I should say 5e will probably turn to 6e at some point, but
5.5 is the announced recently.
Right. Yeah. But I think it's whatever you have a feel for. But I would suggest, definitely jump into both or find people, go on Archives of Nethys and check it out.
Yeah.
Go on Path Builder and build a character and look at the numbers you're going to roll.
Yeah.
And then decide, what do you feel is better? Because it's so easy to get into Pathfinder. And D&D's fun, but
you like Pathfinder,
but Pathfinder's better in my opinion.
I can't talk about the mechanics because like I said, I've never played 5e. I think it could be fun to try one out. One book that I've been eyeing is Icewind Dale, just because I like icy scenarios and stuff. But I do pick up a lot of vibes from the overall community. And one of the first things that I notice is that D&D seems to have sort of a Monopoly vibe. Monopoly, the game, not the
the concept.
The concept of owning everything. Though in effect, it kind of does. But Monopoly is a very popular game. It's a game that almost everyone has played, but sometimes you might not think that there are other board games outside of Monopoly besides, maybe the stuff that you see on the shelf at Walmart. Whereas I have a bunch of independently made board games behind me, like Last Night on Earth, not just apples to apples, but like Codenames, more independently made board games. And that's how D&D feels to me, whereas it's big, it's popular, and you might not always realize that there are other options to play. And I actually had an interaction on D&D Next a little bit ago where I asked the mods there if I could post about Beginner's Box Day, which our Pathfinder 2e is running. And the mods said yes. The mods were awesome, very, very nice. Putting it in there, the community hated it. It was almost like some of them didn't realize that you can like multiple things at the same time. And so to me, D&D seems like a great jumping off point. But the thing that I think is going to be harder to bridge is knowing that D&D isn't the only game out there to play. Neither is Pathfinder. There are a lot of great RPGs out there. Monster of the Week is one of my favorites. There's Vampire the Masquerade. There's the Star Wars ones. But because of the popularity of D&D, I don't know that a lot of people ever get to experience those. And that's kind of a problem I have. But, that's not something that's not Wizards of the Coast's fault. They made a good product. They made a popular product. It got helped out by a lot of ways, but
they had Critical Role do a lot of work for that.
And Community and Stranger Things. They all mention Dungeons and Dragons, and just mentioning that in a popular medium is going to be huge. If Pathfinder got the same thing in what's a popular show nowadays, I don't even know.
Yeah, I don't watch a lot of current TV other than like all the fantasy stuff, which wouldn't make sense when we'd be playing Pathfinder.
But yeah, like a little shout out. But I also have a preference for the Pathfinder art style than overall. I think Paizo puts a lot more effort into their product than D&D does on a visual and quality basis, from what I can tell by browsing through D&D books. Looking at the maps in D&D modules, to me they've always looked just like sort of doodles. They're just like brown sketches of the grid line and the thing, whereas Pathfinder includes fully colored, detailed maps. Paizo makes these really colorful covers for their books. Inside, there are always these very vibrant, colorful pieces of art, whereas I feel like the D&D palette comes down to black, blue, gray, and very bright instances of red, which to me, it just seems like really, really boring. The other thing is that I've noticed from D&D influencers that they seem to complain a lot about the rules in Dungeons and Dragons, and they come up with a lot of homebrew ways to fix those rules. And I have heard of homebrew in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, but never so much to fix something. And I don't know if your experience feels the same, but...
Yeah, I've there's only one rule that really drives me nuts, and it's about both of them, Pathfinder and D&D. And that is when you make a reflex save, you don't have to move, which I think is absolutely insane. Like you're dodging, right? That's the whole point of a reflex save.
Right.
And you literally don't move at all. And that's the only thing that ever it doesn't break the game, I don't think. It's just, like from a storytelling standpoint, as like I'm a person who narrates a lot when we're fighting.
Yeah.
Like it seems so weird to just be like, yeah, you dodge out of the way of this thing, but you're also in the same square you were in. So
yeah.
Would it make it more crunchy? Probably, but it's just a weird thing that I have. But yeah, outside of that, you don't get the same. I mean, the homebrew community in D&D is massive.
Yeah.
And a lot of it is because people feel like they need to do it.
Mm-hmm.
So
overall, I feel like it's the difference between comparing a AAA game to an independent game. Like AAA games are made to suit the lowest common denominator and still be profitable and make a thing. Like the game Battlefront that just recently has come out in the last couple of years when Disney bought Star Wars. Looks beautiful, but as soon as it came out, you heard about all these problems with it, like from the loot boxes to lagging. But it's a big game compared to when Battlefront was made for the PS2 by smaller companies, and it was a marvelous game.
Awesome.
And like Untitled Goose Game, I just played that. That was built by a totally third-party maker, and it was amazing. A really fun, cute experience, but cannot compare money-wise to Elden Ring, for example.
Yeah, for sure.
So those are my overall impressions. I definitely understand why D&D is popular. I'm glad that people are getting into the hobby. I'm glad that people are having a community to go to. But if you put the 2 books in front of me, I would reach for 2E every time.
Yeah. And I will say too, one thing we didn't mention, but I think is an important factor, especially when you're looking at the people who make the games, is that Paizo is now a unionized, the first unionized, I believe, TTRPG game company. And most of what they're put out is written by freelancers, which has, in my reading experience, given a more diverse read, right? Like you're reading stuff that, about NPCs that are agender. You're reading about Black and other POC and NPCs, and there's settings that are written for other people, and it seems much more diverse and inclusive. And I believe a big part of that is because they use freelance writers who have the opportunities to really create something that they would be proud of, and it's not the same writing teams more often than not.
Yes, I was super excited when they unionized, and I completely agree. Mwangi Expanse was completely written by people of color, I want to say, and the tone of the book changes so much from that perspective compared to if it was a totally white crew of people trying to think, how are we going to frame Africa?
Just go read D&D's Cholt and then read the Mwangi Expanse, and then you can make your own opinion. It's not the same.
So, wow, we have had a big episode. There was a lot to cover. If you've still listened to us, we both want to know, what do you think about D&D and Pathfinder? Do you think that you're going to choose one or the other or both based off of this podcast? You can let me know at Rulelord2E.
Yeah, and you can let me know at Secret NRD Social.
So any last things you want to let people know about like projects that are coming up, things you want to plug?
Yeah, so if you enjoyed listening to me talk, of course, just go listen to the podcast. If you'd like to hear how I do Pathfinder 2e, I have 2 different one-shots up, both homebrew one-shots. They're both set in the Mwangi Expanse, but one is set in a homebrewed post-apocalyptic Mwangi Expanse, 83 years after a war. So yeah, they're both a lot of fun. I definitely encourage you to listen to them and hang out and see that. As for myself, I will be continuing to invite more players in to the space to one, teach more people about Pathfinder 2e, but also just to hang out with some of the amazing friends that I made doing this podcast. And yeah, we talked about in the very beginning that I am working on game design and stuff. So I've created one game. You can find it on my website, secretnerdpodcast.com. And it's called The Last Detective. So it has nothing to do with fantasy stuff. It's just if you'd like to play as a detective, the last detective anybody would want to call, you should give it a shot. It's a fun little like 1-shot, 2-shot game where you basically try to redeem yourself in the eyes of your employer before either being caught by the murder or being fired. So yeah.
And then for those of you who are first listening to this podcast because you were directed to it by someone because you asked that question, what's the difference? Rise of the Rulelords is a Pathfinder 2nd Edition educational podcast. Each session tries to cover an aspect of the Pathfinder rule set in a educational and hopefully fun way so that you can learn the system easier than having to read the monster of a core rulebook that Pathfinder 2nd Edition is written in, which really the rule set is not as much of that book as you might think. A lot of it is just the player stuff. But I'm also a mod at our Pathfinder 2E. It's the Pathfinder 2nd Edition Reddit community. If you want a really welcoming, positive group of people to talk about this game more, to get introduced to it more, I highly recommend coming our way, joining us, and asking more about the game. But it has been a very big podcast. I think we're both ready for bed in daylight savings time. So until next session.
And don't let the rules rule you.